Chapter 4. Africa's Lone Star. What is Liberia? For the American Colonization Society Board, the 2,000-plus settlers, and, most pressingly, for the officials at Government House in Monrovia, that was the question of the 1840s. Every group agreed on what it was not, a Western-style nation-state or a tribal entity in the African tradition. And it was not a colony. The U.S. Congress had made certain of that. From the moment they first contributed money in 1819 for the resettlement of African slaves seized from smugglers, Washington policymakers insisted that the United States had no territorial ambitions in Africa. Moreover, no federal money was ever explicitly set aside for the emigration of free blacks or emancipated slaves from America. In the 1820s and 1830s, Liberia was still firmly under ACS control, even after 1825, when, toward the end of Yehudi Ashman's time as agent, the board had reluctantly agreed to a new political dispensation. Executive power would still rest exclusively in the agent's hands, but the colonists would elect a council to advise him. Settler discontent did not abate, however, as evidenced by Joseph Mecklon's tenure as the ACS agent in Liberia from 1829 to 1833. A May 13, 1835, letter from the settler Joseph Blake to the ACS corresponding secretary Ralph Gurley in Washington alleged that Mecklon, who had disappeared from Liberia, had slept with Blake's wife. Dr. Joseph Mecklon Jr. during his residency here committed a most heinous depredation on the peace of my family. He, by criminal conversation, decoyed my wife away, and debauched her. He has left here for me to maintain a mulatto child. The telling passage in the letter followed this initial lament. Permit me to ask your wisdom, Blake wrote, if this is a proper course for one to pursue who was placed at the head of any community. He was put here to be our father and our guide. Blake's letter is an anomaly. There is no other evidence of sexual predation by ACS agents, but there are voluminous records of settler dissatisfaction with the virtual dictatorial powers the board in Washington granted its agents in Monrovia and the high-handedness with which the agents wielded them. The Compromise of 1825, giving settlers a voice, if not a vote, in their own affairs, meant little if the agent remained convinced that his settler charges still needed the firm hand of the plantation overseers they had left behind. Apart from the fact that he was a doctor, little is known of Mecklon's life before he became a colonial agent in 1829. The normally judicious Charles Huberich, author of the exhaustive two-volume Political and Legislative History of Liberia, called Mecklon a reactionary of the worst type. He acted like a petty Caesar in his dealings with neighboring African chiefs. When a local Dey headman, besieged by other tribes, begged for the colony's protection, Mecklon made him a vassal and insisted his people consider themselves Americans, that is, subject to colonial law. This meant that they had to surrender to Liberian merchants their middlemen status in the trade between the hinterland and the coast. When the Dey rose up against this dictate and against encroachments on their lands, Mecklon organized a militia that proceeded to torch the chief's home village. The agent then forced upon him a humiliating treaty that annexed vast new tracts of territory. For this, Mecklon was praised by the settler-run Liberia Herald. His efforts to impose a similar authoritarianism at home did not sit as well with the colonists, however. In his first months on the job, his heavy-handed rule sparked protest and a petition to the ACS board in Washington, demanding Mecklon respect the decisions of the Settler Council. The agent, the petition claimed, had violated the 1825 Constitution by ignoring settler input on official appointments. And his triple role as ACS agent, U.S. government representative, and commander of the colonial militia gave him near absolute power. In their complaint, the petitioners cited the laws upon which the colony had been founded. All persons born within the limits of the territory held by the American Colonization Society, or removing there to reside, shall be free, and entitled to all the rights and privileges of the free people of the United States. The board was not persuaded. Ignoring the irony that the colonists had never enjoyed the rights and privileges of free people when in the United States, Gurley denied each of the petitioners' demands for redress. To their right saw free men appeal, the ACS official responded with the paternalist thinking that had informed the Liberian experiment from the very start. With thinly veiled impatience, Gurley explained that the colonists were not ready to exercise such rights and that the society, through its representative in Monrovia, knew what was best for them. Your committee, i.e., the ACS board, are of opinion that the time has not yet arrived when the powers and duties of the colonist agent can be properly relaxed. Over the next several years, Mecklon further consolidated his power, granting lands and provisions to supporters, forcing natives to trade with the agency rather than with local merchants, and repeatedly vetoing acts of the Colonial Council until he finally dismissed it altogether. The agent did little to hide his contempt for the settlers, especially those who challenged him. In an 1832 letter to the board, Mecklin even questioned the fitness of newly freed slaves to come to Liberia. Of a recent contingent out of Norfolk, he wrote, "I regret to be compelled to state that they are the lowest and most abandoned of their class. From such materials it is vain to expect that an industrious, intelligent and enterprising community can possibly be formed. The thing is utterly impracticable, and they cannot but retard, instead of advancing the prosperity of the colony." Mecklin might have heeded the example Carey and the settlers had made of Ashman. Though backed by the board and surrounded by hand-picked settler officials, he was, in the end, a solitary white man in Africa. By early 1833, most of the colonists were in open rebellion, forcing Mecklin to resign and return stateside. It was not the lowest and most abandoned colonists who spearheaded the demand for self-government, but the colonial elite. Although deaf to the political yearnings of the settlers, Mecklin recognized easily enough the self-interest of others. Facing rising demands for constitutional amendment or alteration during his last months in office, Mecklin hinted to Gurley that his enemies in Monrovia's merchant community had ulterior motives. I mean such amendments would give into their hands the power of making such port regulations, that is, tariffs and other duties, as would affect the intercourse of foreigners with the colony. Should this be committed to their hands, we have no guarantee that they would not on the one hand so stretch their prerogative as to enact laws vexatious and oppressive in their bearing on foreign traders and destructive of our, i.e., the ACS's, commercial interests. Mecklin's assessment is borne out by what followed. The nation's founding fathers were not so different from their American counterparts, who had once enslaved them and their parents and grandparents. The Liberian elite spoke sincerely of liberty and the rights of man, but political freedom, to them and to their descendants, was inseparable from the freedom to make money. To all but the practiced eye of a 19th-century Southerner, keen to the nuances of racial feature and coloration, the Virginia-born Joseph Jenkins Roberts, Liberia's first president, was a white man. Photographs capture his distinctively Caucasian features. One 1844 oil portraitist even gave him wavy locks of auburn hair. Roberts, a dark-skinned settler told a visitor to Monrovia in 1860, is a very fine gentleman, but he is more white than black. In the legalistic but oddly lyrical language of race in antebellum America, Liberia's George Washington was an octoroon, meaning just one of his 8 great-grandparents was black. Under Virginia's one-drop-of-blood rule, however, that was enough. Disproportionately represented among the early settlers and among America's free persons of color, most mulattoes who went to Liberia not only went early, allowing them to acclimatize themselves to the new country and stake claims to its land and institutions, but went with all the advantages their caste had typically enjoyed over freed black slaves: education, training in a craft or profession, a habit of self-reliance, and capital. Roberts enjoyed every one of these advantages. He was born free, in Norfolk, in 1809, the second of 7 children of Amelia Roberts and a father who died when Joseph was young and whose identity is lost to history. His mother was pious and hard-working, attributes that earned her the protection and patronage of influential whites, critical to any free black family's survival and success in the slave South. No less important to Joseph's privileged upbringing was his mother's second marriage, to an ambitious entrepreneur from Petersburg. James Roberts made his small fortune operating flatboats up and down Virginia's riverine tidewater, one of the few businesses open to African Americans of the Chesapeake. When he died, he left his family an estate unusually large for a free black man, 2 houses, several boats, and scattered parcels of land. Joseph and his siblings were undoubtedly influenced by their stepfather's ambition and industriousness. His brother Henry would study at the Berkshire Medical School in Massachusetts and work as a doctor in Liberia, while his brother John would become Bishop of Monrovia's Methodist Episcopal Church. Joseph, for his part, not only learned the elder Roberts's trade but apprenticed as a barber, among the most lucrative of free black professions. He met with luck again when he began working for a free black named William Colson, a man of many talents, entrepreneur, minister of the gospel, and self-educated scholar. Roberts, who received little formal education, was tutored by Colson and given access to his well-stocked private library. Why Amelia and 6 of her 7 offspring decided to emigrate in the winter of 1829 is not known. But the reasons can be guessed. Virginia's racial laws were harsh and getting harsher, even 2 years before the panic set off by Nat Turner's rebellion. Free blacks did not have the right to vote, no right to represent themselves in court, and whites could humiliate them with impunity. The restrictions and racism of Jacksonian-era Virginia were stifling for every free black person, but must have seemed especially galling to a man of means and nearly all-white ancestry. Faith also played a part in the Roberts' decision. Amelia had tried to imbue her children with the piety that sustained her through impoverished widowhood, and it seemed to have taken root in her second son. Like the evangelical founders of the ACS, Joseph Roberts considered himself a subject of the benevolent empire. Later, in his speeches as president of Liberia, he rarely missed an opportunity to invoke the settlers' providential mission. The political happiness or wretchedness of ourselves and our children, and of generations yet unborn, is in our hands, he told the crowd assembled in front of Monrovia's government house during his first inaugural address, nay more, the redemption of Africa from the deep degradation, superstition, and idolatry in which she has so long been involved. As with most aspects of Liberian history, before Roberts and after, the prospect of making money was bound up in the more lofty missions of colonization. Roberts intended to turn his modest inheritance into great fortune in Liberia, but, like most pious Americans of his day, he saw Holy Writ in the commercial ledger, a convergence of impulses with special meaning for Liberia. According to the dogma of colonization, legitimate commerce would drive out illicit commerce, trade in commodities, in addition to providing the settlers with economic opportunities independent of whites, could offer African natives an alternative to the slave trade. In fact, the idea of an all-black trading network, anchored by colonies of enterprising and Christian African Americans, had been broached by the black whaling merchant Paul Cuff at least a decade before the ACS's own colonization plans. And stripped of evangelism, the idea would outlast the ACS itself, informing Marcus Garvey's Pan-African movement of the 1920s. It was in this spirit of benevolence and business that Roberts and William Colson conceived their plans for a transatlantic company, with Roberts as factor in Liberia and Colson as Virginia broker, to deliver American emigrants to Africa and African products to America. Their timing could not have been better. In Liberia, under Agent Joseph Mecklen's command, the settler militia was breaking the resistance of local tribes and opening up the lucrative trade with the tribes of the interior. Roberts's gift for winning business, honed on his stepfather's flatboats, was said to rival those of the legendary Mandingo traders now being pushed aside by colonists. Within a few years of his arrival in Liberia, Roberts was dispatching hides, ivory, camwood, and products derived from the ubiquitous Erica palm to ports up and down America's Atlantic seaboard. He soon became a rich man, joining the tiny, moneyed elite who dominated Monrovia society and politics. The members of this elite socialized and married among their own. One of Roberts's younger brothers wedded the daughter of the Liberia pioneer and Declaration of Independence signer Elijah Johnson. The Liberia Herald editor John Russwurm took Sarah McGill, the daughter of Vice Governor George McGill, as his bride, and Roberts himself married Jane Rose Waring, daughter of the colony's leading ecclesiastic and one of its most successful commercial farmers. They were a relatively homogeneous lot. Charles Thomas, a white visitor in the late 1850s, called Monrovia society an aristocracy of means and education, dominated by the light-skinned, free-born sons and daughters of the Chesapeake. Men like Roberts ran the colony's institutions, from the lay leadership of churches to the officer corps of the militia, and chaired the committees that arranged the frequent civic celebrations that played such a crucial part in Monrovian life in the 19th century. Charitable organizations, such as the Ladies' Benevolent Society and the Ladies' Liberia Literary Institute, were founded and led by the womenfolk of the leading families, while the men established branches of American fraternal organizations, the Odd Fellows, Good Templars, and, above all, the Masons, who elected Roberts as their first Grand Master and whose membership included virtually every leading merchant and member of the governing council. The Liberian elite also lived well. "We found a degree of refinement and taste for which we were not prepared," Thomas wrote, though not without a hint of patronizing criticism. "The people desire to live in comfortable and pretty houses, the ladies in beau dress in fashion, above their means, extravagantly so, and the quantity of kid gloves and umbrellas displayed on all occasions does not promise well for a nation whose hope rests on hard and well-developed muscles." The elite represented their own variant of colonials emulating the imperial metropolis. The Monrovian merchants and their wives were determined to refute racist assumptions that the colonization experiment would fail as the settlers atavistically descended into the savagery that surrounded them and in which they had originated. They endeavored to demonstrate their civilized status, as members of a transatlantic community of Anglo-Saxon refinement and morality. Parents chastised their children for adopting the pidgin quasi or waterside talk of Monrovia's streets and docks, insisting they speak standard American English. And while many of Liberia's merchants and upriver sugar and coffee planters adopted African concubinage, taking on native country wives, elite society was more Victorian than the Victorians. So far as outward behavior, law, and language, they are prudish to a truly American extent, noted the British historian Harry Johnston, during a stay in the 1880s. Sparsest of clothing on the part of the natives is treated as an offense. The Americo-Liberians still worship clothes as an outward and visible manifestation of Christianity and the best of civilization. Still, not all of Monrovia's aristocracy of means and education sought Christian refinement. For Edward Blyden, the West Indian-born black nationalist educator, who would become a kind of Monrovian Socrates, exiled for needling the powerful and radicalizing the young, the elite's civilized pretenses represented hypocrisy of the highest order. Dishonesty stalks abroad under the semblance of piety, and impiety assumes the appearance of religion for the sake of gain. He lectured what must have been an uneasy Independence Day audience in 1857. And, this extravagant manner of living, are made in the minds of many the standard of respectability. We attach more importance to display than to reality. There is very little that is substantial about us. For the poor and middling black majority, however, the problem was less the pretenses of Liberia's ruling class than its power. Through connections with ACS officials and foreign traders, and ownership of the coasting vessels that plied Liberian waters, Monrovia's merchants controlled the flow of goods into and out of the colony, making it difficult for smaller operators. Many Liberian farmers supplemented their meager incomes with petty trade, to compete. The operations of the merchant John Lewis, a brother-in-law of Roberts, were typical. As manager of the ACS warehouse, he controlled most of the colony's tobacco supply, the commodity most coveted by natives and hence most lucrative for settlers. To Sion Harris, a carpenter living in the upriver settlement of Caldwell, Mr. Lewis was engaged in the monopolist trade monopoly. The whole tobacco business, Harris decided, was only good for the merchant. Predictably, the merchant elite's economic stranglehold extended to politics as well. Ever since the constitutional reforms of 1825, which had given the settlers a say in their own affairs, the merchants of Monrovia had been gradually taking control of Liberia's government as well as its economy, a trend the weakened ACS could do little about. By the late 1830s, the society was under siege from all sides. In America, abolitionist and free black broadsides against the idea and practice of colonization had taken their toll, evidenced by declining donations from evangelical philanthropists, the lifeblood of such a capital-intensive enterprise. Relentless accounts in the press of Liberia as a disease-ridden swamp had dissuaded all but a few free blacks, who could pay their own way, from emigrating. And the growing conflict over the fate of slavery meant most members of Congress wanted little to do with colonization, a middle-of-the-road solution that was fast losing its political appeal. The ACS simply did not have the resources to support the colony nor the standing in international law to defend it. European interlopers, drawn by the lucrative trade opportunities and backed by their own governments, were refusing to recognize the sovereignty of what, from their perspective, seemed like a charitable foundation by another name. For years, ACS board members operated under the assumption that they knew what was best for their black charges. But in a paternalistic situation, if the parent cannot provide, the child need not obey. More to the point, paternalism rests on the premise that adults will accept being treated as children. Time and again, history has demonstrated this premise to be unsustainable, and so it proved for the overburdened ACS and the increasingly restive Liberian colonists. In 1838, the board issued instructions to its agent Anthony Williams, assemble delegates from all the major settlements other than the independently run settlement called Maryland and have them draw up a constitution for a more autonomous government. The delegates, unsurprisingly, virtually wrote the ACS out of the decision-making process, but the board summarily dismissed the idea that its agent would no longer have veto power over the decisions of the local legislature. As long as it was, figuratively speaking, putting a roof, however leaky, over the colonists' head, the ACS intended to have the final say. But the constitution the ACS offered in 1839 granted broad powers to the colonial legislature, including the right to declare war, issue currency, and collect tariffs and taxes. It also provided for the creation of an independent judiciary, and included something that benefited the merchant elite in Monrovia, a property requirement to vote. While not an inordinate sum, the minimum $25 in real estate eliminated the poorest and the landless citizens, who represented the majority of the 2,000-plus settlers, from the electoral rolls of what would now be known as the Commonwealth of Liberia. Although Liberia's elite was not altogether pleased with the ACS retaining veto power, most members accepted the new constitution. As it turned out, the ACS appointee to the newly created post of governor, the young Thomas Buchanan, cousin of the last pre-Civil War President of the United States, rarely second-guessed the legislature, even as it passed new tariffs and restrictions on foreign traders. And when the legislature launched punitive expeditions against local tribes, often for failing to pay their debts to Monrovia merchants, Buchanan served as commander. The continuing presence of the ACS was not entirely unwanted. Roberts and other merchants had for years been more than happy to sell the society's supplies when its warehouse for newly arrived emigrants ran low, and often did so, according to an ACS report, at exorbitant prices. In 1834, the board had complained of the ruinous practice of purchasing provisions from the merchants in Liberia on credit. The same businessmen also leased their coasting vessels to the society at high rates to transport emigrants and supplies to far-flung settlements. In Monrovia, these merchant advantages did not go unnoticed. When the society ceased its retailing business in 1841, even Buchanan had to admit that the poor people said it must be the result of a scheme of the merchants, though it had more to do with the ACS's strained finances. Colonists in the outlying settlements along the coast and up the St. Paul's River Valley were especially resentful, paying more for imported goods, getting less for their crops, and often being shut out of the lucrative native trade altogether. The first signs of provincial unrest emerged in Grand Bassa, a tiny settlement 50 miles down the coast from Monrovia. John Sayce, a white, West Indian-born, and entrepreneurial Methodist Episcopal minister, had first come to Liberia in 1834 to evangelize among the natives. The missions he founded served local settlers as well, many of whom earned money working for or selling to the church. Thus, when Buchanan and the legislature revoked the missionaries' exemption from tariffs in 1840, Sayce and many of the outlying settlers, already chafing under the political and economic hegemony of the Monrovia merchants, were outraged. The ambitious missionary, a demagogue according to Roberts and Buchanan, became the figure around which provincials and poor alike mobilized. The citizens, one settler recalled Sayce declaring, ought to rise up and shake off this rotten system of tyranny and oppression. In the 1840 elections, the first under the Commonwealth government in a portent of bitterly divided, post-independence contests, the Sayce faction squared off against Monrovia's elite. Sayce successfully rallied the people he represented, or at least appeared to. At Millsburg, a farming settlement on the St. Paul's River, every voter was employed at unusually high wages on the Sayce Run sawmill and sugar plantation, Buchanan complained, and their every vote was polled for his friends. The other side had its own laments. As one financially struggling settler explained to the ACS board, I am not influenced by money, for I earn a living by the sweat of my brow. Still my situation is far more preferable than if I were placed in a condition where my salary must govern the dictates of my conscience. In the end, the candidates of the government party, all of them businessmen, crushed the Sayce faction. A year later, when Buchanan, Liberia's last white governor, died of fever and Roberts was appointed to replace him, the merchants' takeover of the government was complete. Roberts, a gifted politician, was a source of calm, at least for a time. But as the head of an impoverished outpost of exiled black Americans, he was less effective in disputes with outsiders. While Commonwealth status, constitutional reforms, and a governor from the settlers' own ranks helped to satisfy settler demands for greater autonomy, it meant nothing to the foreign traders or their governments, which insisted on unfettered access to the territory and native trade the Monrovia authorities claimed as their own. By any mid-19th century measure, Great Britain was the best friend the black man generally, and the Liberian people, in particular, had in the Western world. It was the British who, in Sierra Leone, first experimented with the idea of a refuge for former and recaptured slaves. It was the British who first abolished the transatlantic slave trade, in 1807, and enforced the ban with naval patrols. It was the British who, in 1833, became the first European nation to permanently ban slavery in its overseas territories. August 1, Emancipation Day in the Empire, was warmly celebrated by Liberians each year with speeches, banquets, and toasts. And it was the British who in 1847 became the first nation to enter into diplomacy with Africa's first black republic, a full 15 years ahead of the United States. But the friendship had its limits. Britain's unrivaled power and wealth had been built on the ruthless pursuit of trade. When its merchants demanded unimpeded access to markets, whether in 1770s Boston or 1840s Liberia, London backed them without hesitation. The 1840s in Liberia were in part defined by a series of confrontations between British traders and officials in Sierra Leone on the one hand and Liberia's merchants and Commonwealth government on the other. I have the honor to inform you that I have received a complaint from Mr. Dring, master of the British brig Ranger, stating that property to a considerable amount, belonging to him, has been seized at Bassa Cove, by Liberia authorities, under the pretense of an infraction of the laws. So began a lengthy correspondence over 1841 and 1842 between Captain Joseph Denman, commander of the Royal Navy's Sierra Leone Division, and Governor Roberts. The issue was whether British merchants had to pay the Commonwealth's port duties, which would make the goods they were peddling less competitive in the cutthroat competition that marked West African trade. Denman and other officials claimed the right of custom. British subjects had engaged in trade with African tribes and established factories, or trading posts in American parlance, on the windward coast long before Liberia's settlers had shown up, and claimed to have the treaties to prove it. Roberts countered that the occasional trading voyage did not constitute custom, nor did it give the British the right to ignore Liberian law. And he challenged Denman to produce the treaties. But in a letter begging the ACS board to get Washington to look into the matter, Roberts sounded both more desperate and self-serving. British traders sell goods at such reduced prices as to entirely disable the colonists to compete with them. This they, the British, can do without loss, because their goods are bought in England, and the poor colonist can only be furnished with goods second-handed, and very frequently has to pay higher prices than what the natives have to pay at those British factories. Past practices and treaties aside, Denman proffered a more fundamental challenge to the duties. Liberia did not have the authority to impose them. Liberia, a philanthropically inspired exercise in black self-governance, had, before 1847, no legal standing in the eyes of Great Britain. International custom and law simply did not recognize the sovereignty of a privately sponsored territorial entity. In making a case for independence to the ACS board several years after the Denman Exchange, Roberts himself admitted as much. What seems most difficult to be understood in our organization, and which is constantly seized upon as a proof of the dependence of Liberia is, that the chief executive officer of the government is appointed and paid by the Colonization Society, and that all laws enacted by the Liberian legislature shall be subject to a revocation of the society, he wrote to the board in his annual official message of 1846. That an arrangement so novel and without precedence should, in its operations experience some jarrings, is not surprising, nor is it a matter of much astonishment that foreigners, at first view, should consider it complicated and perplexing. Lost in the considered language of official correspondence is the outrage of Liberians that a black-run government should be treated with such disrespect. It has been already said by the British that we have no right to demand anchorage duties and see of them, Peyton Skipwith wrote to his former master, John Coke. If we are to remain in the state we are now in, it is deplorable. British merchants could be imperious. British traders have become so inveterate against our speculators, that they allow them but a small share in the trade along the coast, Roberts noted to the board. They effect this, sometimes, by ordering our traders from the spots they have selected to trade. Backed by the 19th century's greatest naval power, the traders had little to fear. Whenever disputes arose, as in the Dring affair, Her Majesty's government in Sierra Leone was quick to dispatch warships to Liberia's defenseless ports. As Blyden later wrote in his history of his adopted country, British actions called Liberia and all it represented into question. The settlers learned they had no rights which the laws of nations could respect. These facts aroused the thinking people to the desire for an independent national existence. The Reverend Beverly R. Wilson was such a thinking person. A free black of unmixed African descent, Wilson had emigrated from Norfolk with his two sons in 1834. Although he lost one of them to native gunfire, on a supposed peace mission to a rebellious chief, he never looked back, expressing almost uninterrupted pleasure in his decision to take up what he called his African inheritance. And for good reason. Despite being functionally illiterate, Wilson achieved a stature and a level of prosperity unattainable to a black man in his native Virginia. By July 1847, when he served as one of 11 delegates to the Liberian Constitutional Convention, he was a leading merchant who owned 2 Monrovian warehouses valued at thousands of dollars and a lay official of the Methodist Church. At the convention, which was called by Roberts and other merchant leaders, he wasted no time asserting his views. In the words of the white physician J. W. Lucian Beale, whose private journal remains the only extant account of the proceedings, Wilson stood up on the very first day of deliberations and stated that the people of Liberia do not require the assistance of white people to enable them to make a constitution for the government of themselves. At question was a draft constitution, drawn up at the request of the ACS board by the Harvard law professor and Massachusetts Colonization Society officer Simon Greenleaf. 3 days later, Wilson was on his feet again. The people of Liberia have heretofore allowed the Colonization Society to act as their trustees and guardians, he insisted, but that they have now become of age, and are determined to manage their own affairs on their own territory. To Lucian Beale, Wilson's outrage was really sickening, a display of nonsensical egotism. Putting aside Lucian-Beale's contempt for the political efforts of the Black Liberians, his commentary is revealing. In challenging ACS authority, Wilson and the other fire-eaters at the convention were arguing against a straw man. For if they wanted little to do with the ACS, the Society by 1847 wanted even less to do with them. The 1839 Commonwealth Constitution had failed to resolve the existential problem of what Liberia was, as evidenced by the continuing mercantile disputes with Britain. Meanwhile, at home, the ACS continued to be ground down, like other institutions attempting to find common ground on the slavery question, by the forces of relentless polarization. In the South, supporters of colonization were seen as virtual co-conspirators of the abolitionists, a laughable charge to the latter group, who now ignored the ACS, having already won the battle for the hearts, minds, and wallets of anti-slavery Northern philanthropists. Recognizing that turning over sovereignty and governance of the colony to its residents would free up funds for emigrant expeditions, the ACS, at its 30th annual meeting, in January 1846, notified officials in Liberia that a new constitution would be drafted. Liberian independence, momentous as it was no act of revolution. At the time, independence was not even a notably popular idea among Liberians, as the November 1846 balloting on the ACS resolution made clear. A poll called by Roberts in November 1846, even though it excluded natives, women, and any settler with less than $25 in real property, three groups that would have had more reason than any others to fear true independence and the dominance of the merchant elite, resulted in a discouragingly narrow victory for the pro-independence forces. I regret exceedingly to find by official returns that not more than two-thirds of the legal voters of the Commonwealth attended the polls to record their opinion respecting this highly important question, Roberts told the legislature. And of those that did vote, only a small majority cast a yes ballot. Predictably, the governor laid the blame on demagogues like Sayce who fueled public ignorance that the legislature contemplated forming a new government without asking the consent of the people. He called the charge preposterous and lamented the whole acrimonious debate, which prevented that unanimity of action so desirable on the adoption of any great and important measure. Indeed, many settlers who could vote, as well as the poor, saw the agitation for immediate independence as a coup de marchans. Again rallying around Sayce, these poor and middling Liberians, the latter consisting of the Commonwealth's petty traders, small farmers, and tiny professional class, presented a proposal to the convention that pointed out, of all things, the beneficence of the ACS. First resolved, that the citizens of the Grand Bassa County as yet see no cause for a dissolution of the present relation that the Commonwealth of Liberia sustains to its benefactors, the American Colonization Society, and that, under existing circumstances, we consider it a step not only imprudent, but ungrateful in the extreme. It was an untenable position. Outnumbered by the Monrovia party at the convention and defending the unpopular status quo of ACS oversight, the opposition lost to the merchants, just as they had in the 1840 elections. But in insisting upon and achieving independence, the merchant delegates did not act on greed alone. To be sure, they were likely to, and, in fact, did, benefit financially from full sovereignty. They also preferred in their declaration the right to acquire, possess, enjoy and defend property over the pursuit of happiness. But what else could be expected, considering their experiences in America? For freeborn blacks and former slaves, property ownership was one of the few rights they enjoyed under law. Property also assured the black family a modicum of freedom from an oppressive racial order. To the pro-independence delegates, the pursuit of happiness was a luxury of the enfranchised, while property rights were a necessity for those aspiring to that status. In combining higher ideals with self-interest, Liberia's founders were not so different from the framers of the American Constitution. A few of the 1847 delegates were well versed in European political theory, and all were deeply committed to the small r republicanism, economic opportunity, political participation, and equality before the law, from which they had been excluded in America. Christian benevolence permeated the early Liberian Republic, just as it did the American. But whereas the framers of the U.S. Constitution shied away from any explicit mention of divine guidance, their Liberian counterparts invoked Christianity from the start and enshrined its place in the nation. In an official statement that prefaced the Constitution, and served as a kind of declaration of independence, the delegates openly declared, "We the people of the Commonwealth of Liberia, in Africa, acknowledging with devout gratitude, the goodness of God, in granting to us the blessings of the Christian religion, and political, religious, and civil liberty do, constitute ourselves a free, sovereign, and independent state." When the delegate Samuel Benedict presented the document to the citizenry for their approval, he declared, "It is our earnest desire that the affairs of this government may be so conducted as to merit the approbation of all Christendom." Like the vast majority of their compatriots, the delegates were devout men. More than half were preachers or lay officials in the dominant Baptist and Methodist churches. Not only had faith helped African Americans endure slavery and discrimination, but it provided the moral framework for the colonization idea. Both white sponsors and black settlers ritualistically invoked Psalm 68:31, "Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth its hand unto God." In the final analysis, however, race outweighed all other considerations in the thinking behind and the writing of the Liberian Constitution, which was officially called the Declaration of Rights. Slavery, needless to say, was explicitly banned by the Declaration, but the framers pressed the matter further. The great object of forming these colonies, being to provide a home for the dispersed and oppressed children of Africa, and to regenerate and enlighten this benighted continent. Article V, Section 13 read, "None but persons of color shall be admitted to citizenship in this republic." The framers justified the clause as a defensive measure necessary to prevent white outsiders from buying up land and businesses in the new republic. A separate clause stated that only citizens could own land. In essence, the delegates recreated in their constitution the truth hiding behind the principles of the American Constitution. The people in the Liberian constitutions, "we the people," explicitly meant black men and women only. As the ringing cadences of the delegate Hilary Tidge's preface to the Liberian Constitution, which the 11 delegates of the convention offered to the Liberian citizenry and the world on July 26, 1847, intoned. "We, the people of the Republic of Liberia, were originally inhabitants of the United States of North America. In some parts of that country, we were debarred by law all the rights and privileges of men, in other parts. Public sentiment, more powerful than law, frowned us down. We were everywhere shut out from all civil office. We were excluded from all participation in government. We were taxed without our consent. We were made a separate and distinct class, and against us every avenue to improvement was effectually closed. We uttered our complaints, but they were unattended to. All hope of a favorable change in our country was thus wholly extinguished in our bosoms, and we looked with anxiety abroad for some asylum from the deep degradation." Exactly 2 months later, the Constitution was put to a popular vote. Feelings still ran high. Many in the SACE faction refused to participate. Of the 214 votes cast for the Constitution, out of a total of only 270, more than half came from Monrovia, where the lopsided count was 111-0. Even had there been no boycott, it probably would have passed, though by a narrower margin of perhaps 50. In any event, these numbers are remarkably low. In 1843, the last year before independence that a census was taken, the settler population stood at 2,390. 4 years later, it had probably grown by a few hundred, meaning that just 10% of the population voted. Only twice that number was even eligible to vote, of course, after the exclusion of women, minors, and the landless. Far more conspicuous in their absence were the natives, tens of thousands of whom lived in the territory claimed by the new republic. But to have included them in the ranks of citizens would have swamped the settlers and eroded the very reasons for the republic in the first place, as a refuge for free blacks and freed slaves from America. The Constitution did not ignore the native population altogether, however. Article V, Section 14 forbade individual settlers from purchasing native lands, presumably to ward off unscrupulous speculators. Section 15 aimed at weaning the natives from the slave trade, the improvement of the native tribes and their advancement in the arts of agriculture and husbandry being a cherished object of this government. It shall be the duty of the President to appoint in each county some discreet person whose duty it shall be to make regular and periodical tours through the country for the purposes of calling the attention of the natives to these wholesome branches of industry. Despite these provisions, however, the natives, who outnumbered the settlers by 25 or 50 to 1, depending on how far Liberian jurisdiction actually extended, were strangers in their own land, subject to Liberian law but excluded from citizenship, as were the recaptive slaves who remained under the guardianship of the U.S. government agent in Monrovia. The country was divided into coastal counties, where Americo residents were citizens, and inland territories with virtually no voice in the government. Paternalism won out over racial solidarity. For those natives or recaptives who shared tribal language, dress, and custom, there was a path to citizenship. But those who resisted Liberian authority would be declared enemies, and made war upon. Some black men, in other words, were less equal than others. the delegates could seem blind to this reality. During a particularly contentious convention debate over whether the ACS should retain any rights to territory in the new republic, Lucian Beale quoted Reverend Wilson as saying that the territory of Liberia belongs to the citizens of Liberia, as an inheritance from their forefathers, that they are the proper descendants of the original proprietors of the soil, and, therefore, that they are the proper inheritors of the whole country. Thus, amid celebrations accompanying the unfurling of the Liberian flag and the first look at the national seal that declared the love of liberty brought us here, the original inhabitants of the land were all but forgotten. As the convention's Independence Declaration had it, we, the people of the Republic of Liberia, were originally inhabitants of the United States of North America. The omission would haunt the Republic for the rest of its days.